There has been an incredibly concerning trend in the gaming industry over the last few years that I just can't stop thinking about. Publishers and developers seem obsessed with live service games, despite the very many massive failures we've seen from the genre. It's reaching a point where things are becoming extremely unsustainable, and I'm worried about its effect on the future of games. In today's video, we'll be talking about the dangers of live service, the reasons why studios are willing to take the risk, and where I would like to see things go from here. First, let's start by defining what exactly a live service game is, and why we've seen so many of them released in the past few years. A live service game, also known as games as a service, refers to a video game designed to keep you playing for as long as possible. A live service game will receive countless updates over months or years designed to keep you coming back. These games are also almost always accompanied by heavy monetization through in-game currencies, cosmetics, or battle passes. If you've played literally any multiplayer game over the last 5 years, you've no doubt encountered what I'm describing. It's not hard to see why so many game companies are choosing to go down this path. A success in this genre means years of huge profits, all stemming from one game. Long gone are the days where teams had to constantly put out multiple games to keep the lights on, running the risk of releasing something that people didn't like. Nowadays, just one live service success can set your team up for the next decade. And with the rising costs of game development, the idea of having one product that exists in perpetuity instead of having to fund several different games is a pretty promising concept. The only problem is, true success in this genre is not easy to achieve. It takes a lot to get it right. Not only do you need to deliver a great game, but you then need to continually put out frequent, well-liked updates, all while finding ways to keep monetization flowing. But that difficulty certainly hasn't stopped companies from trying. And this is where my problems begin. Although we can all understand why game studios are pushing for live service, the extent to which they've done so has just become absurd. To me, it has almost started to feel like some kind of disease that these executives just can't get out of their head. The allure of a success in this genre has sent multiple studios down wild paths that make no logical sense. Let's take a look at a few of the most egregious examples so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. In 2023, WB Games released Hogwarts Legacy. The single-player open-world RPG set the world on fire, selling 12 million copies in its first 2 weeks. It went on to become the best-selling game of 2023, beating out massive hits like The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom and Baldur's Gate 3. It even managed to outsell the usual annual chart toppers that are Madden and Call of Duty. Hogwarts Legacy continued selling at a high level throughout its second year on the market, hanging on as the 11th best-selling game in 2024. The game has now sold 30 million units to date. You cannot ask for numbers any better than that. So, what did WB Games do next following their massively successful, fully single-player game? Well, they spent all of 2024 putting out multiplayer live service games that each bombed horrifically. The main game I would like to focus on is the infamous Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. This game perfectly exemplifies everything wrong with the live service push in the gaming industry today. You have a team in Rocksteady that became famous for creating some of the best single-player superhero games of all time with the Batman Arkham trilogy. So, what do you have them do next? Make a multiplayer live service game, of course. The troubled development of Suicide Squad is a story that has been told plenty of times before, so we don't need to get into it too much. But it goes without saying that this was an incredibly flawed concept from the very beginning. Kill the Justice League does not benefit in any way from the inclusion of its live service elements. They were only there to sound marketable to a room full of executives. And I think that describes how a lot of live service games end up feeling. It's unfortunate because, in theory, live service should benefit both the developers and the consumers. Like I said earlier, if a developer makes a game that really hits, they can just continue supporting that and avoid the risks involved with future projects. Meanwhile, live service should be good for the players as well because the games they play will last them for years instead of a couple weeks or a couple months. But as is the case with most things in business, the results aren't quite as pure. Many live service games feel like they've been designed that way only to squeeze more money out of you, or instill a sense of FOMO that forces you to keep playing. It's no wonder that so many gamers are starting to turn their back on the genre. The concept of live service had once been a selling point, but now it's a big red flag for many. Suicide Squad seemed to be a major turning point in the gaming community, where everyone collectively agreed that a game like this just doesn't need to be live service. And here's the biggest problem with the whole Suicide Squad situation. Rocksteady will never be the same now. Over the course of Suicide Squad's tumultuous development, they lost countless developers and leaders, including Rocksteady co-founders Sefton Hill and Jamie Walker. Following the failure of the game, the studio was hit with layoffs, meaning even more potentially long-time members of the team were on the way out. So now, Rocksteady is left as a husk of its former self. By the time the publisher realizes they should just stick to single-player Batman games, we're now 10 years removed from the last time they made those games, with huge chunks of the team no longer there. And you expect me to be excited for a new Batman game? I hope I'm wrong, and whatever this potential new Batman project is can turn out amazing. But I don't have high hopes because we've seen this story before. We've seen this exact same situation with EA and BioWare. BioWare was known for their genre-defining single-player RPGs, specifically the Mass Effect and Dragon Age franchises. But in 2012, they began developing on what would become Anthem, a co-op multiplayer experience. Over the long development cycle, we saw the same pattern as Suicide Squad, with longtime leaders and developers who didn't want to go down this path leaving the company. Now we've seen BioWare try to get back to their roots and struggle following this restructuring. Their most recent game, Dragon Age the Veilguard, did not receive the acclaim or sales numbers EA was hoping for. EA's CEO Andrew Wilson told investors the game struggled because players are seeking shared world features and deeper engagements. In other words, EA's CEO thinks Dragon Age would have done better if it was live service. Now, I haven't played the Veilguard, so I can't comment on its quality, but I can assure you, the reason it failed is not because it didn't have a battle pass in it. And this is what I mean by the live service disease that has taken over the industry. How can someone see everything that happened with Anthem and BioWare and still think that's the correct path for the studio to go down? How have we devolved so far as an industry that our only solutions we can think of to better the product is adding multiplayer and crossover skins? It's terrifying to me. The last company I want to talk about that has clearly fell victim to the live service obsession is PlayStation. In 2023, it was reported that PlayStation had 12 different live service projects in the works among their first and second party teams. The messaging around this initiative at the time was that Sony was essentially trying to fail-safe the live service model. In other words, they would only need one or two of these 12 games to hit, and it would cover the development costs of all the other games and then some. At the time, it made sense. Releasing many live service games will increase the odds of finding a hit. Pretty simple stuff. But as time has gone on, it's become clear just how mismanaged this whole thing was. Of the reported 12 games, only 2 have actually been released. One was Helldivers 2, which was a phenomenal success, but the other was Concord, the biggest failure in the history of PlayStation Studios. As for the 10 other games, almost all of them have been cancelled. There are a few stragglers like Fair Games, Bungie's stuff, and a Horizon multiplayer game, but that's all that's left. Other projects like The Last of Us Online, Twisted Metal, Spider-Man, Ben's new game, a God of War game, and London Studios game are all gone. As a PlayStation fan, it has been an incredibly disheartening experience. When I heard 12 live service games were being made, I understood that some would succeed and some would fail. But I didn't anticipate 75% of them would just straight up be cancelled. There's been so much wasted time and money over the PS5 generation that could have been spent on the games PlayStation does best. It's the same thing I said about BioWare and Rocksteady, and it applies to any other game company forcing themselves down this path as well. PlayStation could have had those teams put out several single-player games and made a damn good amount of money, but they would rather waste years shoveling money into live service just for the slight chance that something they make could become the next Fortnite. Okay, I think I've made my point. There's been a lot of live service failures, but even the successes are concerning to me, because I think there was a whole other layer to this live service problem that I haven't seen many talking about, and it's the effect this genre has had on the gaming industry and community as a whole. As I said in the intro, live service games are meant to keep you playing for as long as possible. In a perfect world, NetEase will keep you locked into Marvel Rivals for the next 5 years of your life. And while that's great for the few games that make it in this space, what happens to all the other games? There's only so many gamers in the world, and only so many hours in a day. I think this is something that a lot of game developers forget when trying to break into live service. Let's say someone loves Fortnite and plays it every single day for multiple hours. Let's also assume this person has other life responsibilities like work, school, friends, family, or whatever else. It would be fair to assume that this person only has a few hours a day to play games, and therefore 2024 has no time for any game other than Fortnite. For each person that gets locked into this cycle, it's another person who now has no time for any other games. With each new live service smash hit, there are giant chunks of the gaming community sticking by that game and not playing anything else. We can't have millions of players just playing the same 5 or 10 games while hundreds of other games are getting released every year. Here's an example of how bad it's gotten. It was reported that in 2024, only 15% of total playtime on Steam came from games released in 2024. In contrast, 37% of playtime was spent on games that have been out for 8 years or more. A large reason for this giant discrepancy is live service, with games like PUBG, Dota, Warframe, and Rainbow Six Siege topping the charts. Meanwhile, games like Fortnite or Rocket League top PlayStation's most played games list every single month and year. Having gamers spending most of their time playing these live service games that came out years ago is a pretty terrifying trend for anyone releasing new games today. It's just not a sustainable business model for the future growth of the industry. Another element that has come from live service games that isn't sustainable is the expectation that every game now needs to be updated forever. I was watching the recent PlayStation State of Play the other day and saw Monster Hunter Wilds announcing multiple updates before the game has even been released. It just made me sit back and think, man, is it tough to make a game nowadays. It's no longer enough to just make the game. You need to also prepare months or years of constant updates and make sure they're ready to go as soon as possible. It also makes me think about the canceled Last of Us Online game. In Naughty Dog's statement, they said they chose to cancel the game because the continual updates and support required would have harmed their single-player games business. But Naughty Dog has been doing multiplayer for years. They had multiplayer in multiple Uncharted games and had factions in The Last of Us. I think about Factions specifically, which has not received an update for many years, yet still has people playing it to this day. Is it a large number of people? Of course not, but it just goes to show that multiplayer games don't need a constant carousel of new updates and additions to be fun to play. It's great that we have some games that are able to keep up that schedule, but we can't expect it from every game. Why have we reached a point where Naughty Dog doesn't feel comfortable releasing a multiplayer game because they don't know if it will have longevity? This is a Last of Us game we're talking about here. Just sell it for $40, watch 5 to 10 million copies fly off the shelves, and let people play for as long or as little as they want. Even if no one is playing in a year, who cares? You made a game and sold a game. But no, it's no longer enough to sell the game and make money. You now need to find a way to keep players engaged and spending forever, or the game is considered a failure. And this is where the live service brain rot really kicks in, for both developers and the gamers themselves. I cannot tell you how tired I am of seeing people pulling up Steam player counts and talking about games dying. Steam player counts can be a helpful tool to see how a game is doing, especially after a big update or a controversial decision. But the manner in which people have been using it has just become ridiculous. I remember with Starfield, for example, there were entire articles being written about the player count going down, as if it was a live service multiplayer game and not a single player game that is meant to be played and then put down. The same thing also happened with Palworld, where people stalked that game's player count for months to try and prove a point. But the reality is, Palworld came from a fairly small indie team that made a game millions of people bought. Even if literally 0 people were still playing today, it was still a massive success for them. Gamers love to give executives flack for their obsession over live service and how quick they are to shut down games and studios. And while that's true, I would argue many of us are playing into it when we push these kinds of narratives using something as basic as a Steam player count as the be-all and end-all of game success. As I wrap this video up, I want to be clear about something. Despite all of the negatives I've talked about with live service, I'm not saying that the concept needs to go away. This isn't some call to action that we need to destroy all live service video games. There is nothing wrong with them existing, and I have spent thousands of hours playing these kinds of games myself. The problem is that we're expecting every game to fit this archetype, when that just doesn't make any sense. It's amazing that we have games like Fortnite that last forever and continually get huge updates, but there's also nothing wrong with a game that you play for a few weeks and then move on from. It's time for both gamers and developers to stop expecting every game to last a decade because it's just not possible. I look at the graveyard of dead live service games and think, how many of these games could have been successful under different circumstances? If these games were released in the 360 PS3 era, how many of them would have been seen as fun, well-liked games that could have rode off into the sunset, being played by their communities that enjoyed them? Instead, they were released in today's era, where publishers will pull the plug and erase your game from existence the second profits aren't coming in. Instead, they were released in an era where any game that doesn't sustain millions of players and billions of dollars for a decade is somehow automatically a failure. I feel very strongly that we are reaching a breaking point in our industry. Once this dam bursts, there will be one of two outcomes. Either gamers and developers will finally move on from the live service disease that has overtaken them, or we'll live in a world where not nearly as many games are being made, and where many of the kinds of games you currently enjoy are not being supported. I think we can all agree that outcome sounds pretty terrible. In order to avoid this, I implore game studios to stop pushing this genre onto developers and games that simply aren't a fit. Some games can be live service, and some just can't. It's the nature of the business. And I ask gamers to stop judging game success purely off of longevity and instead on the merit of the game itself. Maybe if these two things come together, we can get back to the way gaming used to be, when games were released and judged based on what they were, and not how long they were able to drain your credit card.